The title of my talk today is The Merits of Social Credit Rating in China, an exercise in interpretive pro-Sen ethical pluralism. My name is Rockwell Clancy. Social credit rating in China consists in giving each and every citizen a score based in part on financial information and then also social information. This plan has been described as dystopian and Orwellian. Sometimes in attempting to defend this system, value differences are invoked. In other words, Chinese value stability and cooperation versus privacy and freedom. This is an oversimplification, however. My talk today, I'll argue that social credit rating in China is a response to a commonly human problem of large-scale cooperation. This is a cultural evolutionary framework, an exercise in interpretive pro-Sen ethical pluralism, explaining how cultural differences stem from common human concerns. Condemnations of social credit rating in China fail to acknowledge the serious, intractable nature of problems that result from a lack of trust in contemporary China. It takes for granted norms ensuring large-scale cooperation characteristic of, but somewhat unique to, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures. Because of antisocial punishment, social credit rating might be one of the few ways to ensure cooperation at this scale in China. To do so, my presentation will be divided into 4 parts. I'll begin by giving some background on intercultural approaches to technology ethics and the one adopted here. Next, I'll go on to talk about what cooperation is and how one gets to it. Third, I'll discuss China as a small-scale society and why that's a problem. And then finally, I'll describe the problem of antisocial punishment and how social credit rating in China might be one of the few ways to address this problem. Part 1. Technology, Values, and Evolution. Inter- and cross-cultural explorations of technology ethics have typically done so in terms of values, conceiving of culture in terms of values. This is problematic, I would argue, because it doesn't offer any type of resolution. Social credit rating in China shows the limits of value approaches as well as the merits of cultural evolutionary theories of technology. On the values approach, Chinese would adhere to Eastern values where the greatest good consists in something like social stability and group cohesion, and if policies accord with these values, then there would be nothing wrong with these policies. Values are typically conceived as long-standing beliefs or ideas about which states are worth pursuing, which guide people's behaviors. Value approaches to technology ethics are problematic from both a normative and empirical perspective. Normatively, simply because some states are preferred does not say anything about why they should be preferred, which ones are better or worse. Empirically, value approaches first do a poor job picking out cultural groups. The values of mainland Chinese, Hong Kongese, and Singaporean Chinese are more similar to those of people in Zimbabwe, Israel, and Malaysia respectively than they are to each other. And values differentially predict behaviors by cultural groups. Cultural evolutionary approaches, by contrast, attempt to understand culture in terms of mechanisms similar to those of natural evolution, and they're empirically supported by a variety of methodologies, including mathematical modeling, economic games, cognitive science, and so on. Culture, on this view, would consist in, first, social information, transmitted in and through behaviors that makes differences to long-term behaviors. Technologies, from this perspective, would be understood in terms of responses to commonly human problems. Social credit rating in China would be a response to the commonly human problem of large-scale anonymous cooperation. Part 2. Cooperation, China, and large groups. Cooperation consists in an individual incurring a cost or foregoing a benefit for a net benefit to the group, where the collective good is greater than and in conflict with the individual. Trust is required for cooperation. There has to be trust that others will incur a cost or forego a benefit in order for all individuals to enjoy the collective good. Various social issues and ethical dilemmas can be understood in terms of cooperation problems involving trust. Especially in China, this would consist in things like construction, transportation, health, and food disasters. Anthropologists and economists have used economic games to precisely measure cooperation under different types of controlled conditions. This would be in contrast to studies of values that typically consist in asking people what they believe in or what they care about. One particular set of economic games are cooperation games. In cooperation games, players decide how much to put into a common pot, and then, after one round, the money in the middle is multiplied by some percentage and then distributed among all the players equally. The dilemma is as follows. It's best for the group if everyone puts in all their money. However, it's best for the individual if everyone else puts in all their money and the individual also hangs on to all their money as well. Cooperation typically begins high in these games and then falls as defection increases and trust decreases, once others start putting less money in the center. In order to stabilize cooperation rates, punishment is introduced. Punishment consists in paying a certain amount so that another player loses some amount. This is called costly punishment, and it results from the fact that in the real world, punishment and monitoring cost a certain amount. For example, the costs of police officers, courts, and so on. Players who contribute too little typically give more later because they're afraid of being punished. This type of punishment is also sometimes referred to as altruistic punishment, since as a result of one individual incurring the cost of punishing others who don't put in enough, it's beneficial to the group as a whole. Cooperation here can be understood in terms of direct and indirect reciprocity. Direct reciprocity is where I treat others how they treat me. Indirect reciprocity is when I treat others how they treat other people also. This works in relatively small groups, but it becomes problematic in larger groups. The Dunbar number is the number of relations that human beings are capable of keeping track of at any one time. The upward limit on this is 150 relations. Human beings have historically lived in relatively small groups of 50 to 150 individuals. Larger than this, direct and indirect reciprocity can no longer explain rates of cooperation. Instead, large-scale cooperation requires institutions. Institutions are collections of intrinsically motivating norms or norm systems, which are informal rules about behaviors that are obligatory or forbidden, with some type of sanctioning mechanism. These have evolved over hundreds and thousands of years throughout the weird cultures. China has not had the time to adapt to a large-scale civilization. Problems in contemporary China are not the result of Chinese having lost their values. They result from the fact that Chinese institutions are ill-adapted to large-scale present-day China. Part 3. Small China, Big Gods, and Social Norms. China has had a population of hundreds of millions since at least the Tang Dynasty. However, these people have worked and lived together in relatively small groups. Chinese social relations tend to be dyadic and hierarchical in nature. Families, historically, have worked the same land for generations, where it was easy to keep track of different social relations. In this scheme, designated authorities would be responsible for monitoring and sanctioning. In some ways, this can be understood as a response to the problem of heaven being high and the emperor being far away, or difficulties involved in a central authority governing all of China. Since reform and opening up, however, there's been a relaxation in the hukou system. Rural residents were capable of moving to cities, and city dwellers were capable of moving between cities. Trusting close others is central to the importance of guanxi in Chinese business relations. This, however, can result in corruption in terms of nepotism and then less trust and cooperation. This is not, however, unique to China. Intrinsically motivating norms and norm systems facilitate trust in and cooperation between anonymous individuals in large-scale societies. These have been associated with and facilitated by the evolution of pro-social religions or big God religions. Big gods are supernatural watchers and punishers that take on the costly work of monitoring and punishing individuals. Co-religionists of big god religions tend to trust each other more and work together, since they have the same moral code and God monitoring them. Big god religions coincided with the rise of markets and trade. These give rise to unique norms and norm systems and cultural psychologies among adherents to big god religions. These have been codified and secularized, resulting in weird cultures, which are outliers on self-concepts, thought styles, and measures of fairness and trust. Cooperation and trust are highest amongst weird cultures. It would be easy for individuals from weird cultures to take for granted large-scale cooperation and institutions that ensure this cooperation, overlooking impediments to its development. If groups don't already cooperate, then getting them to do so is almost impossible. Part 4. Problems of antisocial punishment and solutions in social credit rating in China. Introducing punishment stabilizes and increases cooperation, but only among weird samples. Multicultural samples vary, and introducing punishment does not necessarily stabilize or increase cooperation. Sometimes it decreases it, including among Chinese participants. This coincides with what's called antisocial punishing because 1, one has given too much, or 2, because others have punished others, or in retaliation for the initial punishment. Rates of antisocial punishment are negatively correlated with social cooperation and rule of law. This means that punishment only facilitates cooperation when cooperation is already high, otherwise it impedes it. These dynamics correspond to real-world examples. These likely result from the hierarchical, role-based relations. Those in authority would be responsible for punishing. In Confucian ethics, one should recognize the role one occupies and act accordingly. China has a huge population, as a result of which it would be difficult for any one authority to monitor and sanction everyone. As anonymity increases, there's less trust and sanctioning and more defection in cooperative problems. Antisocial punishment means that punishing can't simply be outsourced to each and every single individual of the population. Only legitimate authorities would be responsible for punishing. The Communist Party and government bureaus enjoy legitimacy in China as a result of their economic and social management. Social credit rating in China would be one of the few ways to avoid antisocial punishment, which would in turn enhance the legitimacy of the Communist Party and government bureaus, enhancing prosociality in turn. This results from the fact that in countries where there's a higher belief in hell or eternal punishment, there's less crime. This belief better predicts rates of crime than GDP or income distribution. Belief in heaven or eternal reward is positively associated with crime. External rules associated with social credit rating in China would eventually become internalized, resulting in intrinsic motivation to cooperate. Summary. This presentation has been a pros han, ethical pluralist interpretation of social credit rating in China. I've argued that social credit rating in China is a particular cultural response to a commonly human problem of large-scale cooperation. To do so, my presentation was divided into 4 parts. First, I began by discussing intercultural approaches to ethics based on values, arguing instead that one needs to adopt a cultural evolutionary approach. Second, I explained cooperation as a commonly human problem. Third, I explained why China should be understood as a small-scale society and why that's a problem. And then finally, I explained the phenomena of antisocial punishment and how social credit rating in China would be a solution to this problem.